I am ex-Detective Inspector Walter Henry Thompson and was Winston Churchill's bodyguard for a period of nearly 18 years.
In almost any piece of film you'll see of Britain's great wartime leader, this is the man in the background, anonymous and secret. Until now, his critical role in saving the life of Churchill from a series of attacks has been hidden from the wider public.
He himself intended that he would never be taken alive, and he issued direct instructions to me. I was to have his 4.5 Colt fully loaded. He intended to use every bullet but one on the enemy. The last one he saved for himself.
After the war, Walter Thompson's censored book told just part of the story. His full memoirs were suppressed even by Churchill himself. Only now can we recount the number of assassination attempts on Churchill's life, many foiled by Walter. This series, with unique access to these incredible memoirs, reveals for the first time the story of Walter's life with Winston. Together they traveled thousands of miles on precarious journeys to meet Stalin and Roosevelt and other world leaders. Together they rode with Lawrence of Arabia, dodged German assassins, were nearly shot down by enemy aircraft, lone gunmen, U-boats, and IRA hitmen. This is a story of the political upheavals of the 20th century. Churchill's constant brushes with death and the role played by an ex-post office messenger in preventing an early end to his life.
And with this weapon, he was a dead shot. Anyone that came within range of this weapon would never survive.
When France surrendered, Winston had been Prime Minister for just 6 weeks. During that time, he had flown to France on 6 occasions to try to stiffen the resolve of the French government as the German Blitzkrieg swept aside the Allied armies. Walter had been with him on each of these occasions, and the dangers had been enormous. Their small plane was usually unescorted, and often flying well within the range of the German Luftwaffe, which effectively controlled the skies over northern France. Walter may have thought that this was bad, but as this program shows, the next year was to bring a host of new perils. For as the bombs rained down on Britain, the one person to whose safety Winston gave no thought was himself. And Walter had to cope as best he could. Winston Churchill's reaction to the surrender of France in June 1940 surprised his bodyguard, Detective Inspector Walter Thompson, as he noted in his journal.
It seemed as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and that his way in the future was now clear. It meant a fight to the finish, but who better could have been our leader under such circumstances?
Britain and her empire were now alone against the rampant Nazis. Hitler was convinced that the country's leaders would soon realize the hopelessness of their position and sue for peace, but he had reckoned without Churchill's determination. Almost immediately came an event which showed how ruthless Winston was ready to be.
Winston was faced with a most difficult decision, probably one of the most tragic he would ever be called upon to make. What was to happen to the French fleet? If these ships fell into German hands, many of them would be ranged against us. The French government would not give any satisfactory reply on the subject of their disposal, as it appeared that Pétain was now working with the Germans. A most momentous decision must be taken. Churchill did not shrink from it, although I know how hurt he was when he gave the order to prevent them from falling into Hitler's hands. It was an unutterable grief and pity to have to deal with an ally in this manner, and I know how deeply Winston felt it. However, in view of the release by the French of several hundred first-class German pilots, many of whom had been captured by us, Winston knew he could no longer rely on the French as allies.
For Walter, it meant yet more people to watch out for, who had reasons to want to take revenge on Winston. Winston had now shown he would stop at nothing to defend Britain, but his most immediate priority was to prepare the nation for a probable German invasion. There was an ominous lull during July and early August. But on the 12th of August, the Luftwaffe began its attempt to achieve air supremacy over southern England so that a landing could be made. For the next month, the Battle of Britain was a desperately close-run thing. The two sides were evenly matched in fighter numbers, but the chain home radar system, which Winston had played a key part in setting up, gave the RAF a vital edge. But after less than a week, the strain was telling. On the 20th of August, having just visited Fighter Command headquarters and seen that at the height of the raids no more reserves were available, Winston paid his famous tribute to the pilots and ground crew.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
This was just one of the great speeches with which he sustained the morale of the British people. Speeches which he dictated to the pretty young secretary Mary Sherburne, who was soon to play a key role in Walter's life. But just when it seemed that the RAF might be about to crack, the Germans changed their tactics. On the 7th of September, they switched to mass bombing of London and other cities. This gave the RAF the respite it needed. German bomber losses during daylight raids were soon so great that they had to switch to night operations. The Blitz was unrelenting. London was bombed heavily every night bar one, up to mid-November. Churchill naturally insisted on remaining in London throughout the battle. Precautions were taken to protect him, as Walter describes, but often Winston seemed oblivious to the dangers.
I do not think that he would ever have entered an air raid shelter, except that he thought he should set an example to others in this matter. However, the daylight bombing was becoming heavier, and it was realized that a more powerfully built building must be used. At the Westminster end of Whitehall, there is a large, very powerfully built government building. And at the St. James's Park entrance, basements were removed, and over 15 feet of steel rails in concrete were put in, under which a most powerful air raid shelter was constructed.
This annex, as it became known, is now open as the Cabinet War Rooms. It was intended to be a bomb-proof control center from which Winston could operate, but as usual, he seemed to go out of his way to frustrate the people trying to protect him.
When I saw bedrooms there for Winston and his wife, I felt very happy to think that he would be in a reasonably safe place. How wrong I was. He would go down there with the service chiefs and hold meetings night after night. Then on most occasions, until the excessive night bombing, he would return to Downing Street. Winston slept on the top floor, and no efforts on my part, or on that of anyone else, would deter him from sleeping there.
Walter made other attempts to force Winston to look after himself, and on one occasion received a very surprising response.
One night we were very close to a bomb which dropped, and I at once asked him to take cover. To my surprise, on one occasion he replied, "I'm sorry to take you into danger, Thompson. I would not do it, only I know how much you like it." "I'm not so sure about that, sir," I replied. "What I am concerned about is your safety. I do think that you should avoid walking the streets and risking your life unnecessarily." Firmly and sincerely came the answer which overcame all my protests. "When my time is due, it will come. But I have much to do first. Don't worry, Thompson."
Winston's enthusiasm for rushing out to watch the bombing also worried much more powerful people than Walter.
One night, His late Majesty, King George VI, dined with Winston in a basement room at number 10, which had large supporting beams put into the ceiling. An air raid commenced and became very heavy, and everyone adjourned to the shelter, Winston and I being the last to enter. Within a few minutes, he turned to His Majesty, saying, "I must go out and see how things are going." "I wish you would not do so, Winston," replied the king, but he was already on the move out into the garden.
Winston's determination to see everything at close hand meant that there were inevitable near misses.
As the bombing of London increased in violence, he seemed to take more chances and would walk the streets from Downing Street to the government building, which we called the Annex. On one occasion, he came out of number 10 and told me to send the drivers away to have their meals, and he would walk. My plea to him not to do so fell on deaf ears, but on reaching the Annex, we had only just stepped inside when a bomb exploded on the very spot which we had walked over seconds before. He turned to me perfectly calmly and said, "It sounds like a bomb, Thompson. Let us go out and have a look." But that night, I learnt something which, since 1921, I'd been waiting to hear from him. Over the years of peace, on so many occasions, there were words used by him which made me think that he had a very strong religious belief.
Still shaken after the near miss, Walter was waiting as Winston emerged from his dining room.
As he did so, he took hold of my arm and in a way pulled me towards him. "Thompson," he said, "when you came to me in 1939, I told you something unusual. Do you remember?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "You had decided to do the unusual thing of taking notice of the threat which you had been informed of prior to leaving France. Then you added the words, 'because I have something to do.' They are the words I wanted, Thompson," he said, "because now we have come to the second phase. There is someone looking after me besides you, Thompson." "Do you mean Sergeant Davis?" I asked. His finger went up in the characteristic gesture which he used as he said, "No, Thompson. I have a mission to perform, and that person will see that it is performed." I realized then his belief in a supreme being. In some of his wartime speeches, he has said he felt a guiding hand was showing him which path he should take, or which road he should go by. Following these remarks to me, whenever we had a near miss from death, he would say, "That was a near one, Thompson, but the mission has to be performed."
More than 50,000 Londoners were killed during the Blitz, and as Walter must sometimes have felt, it was amazing that Winston did not end up as one of them, for the ferocity of the German attacks was unrelenting. As the autumn of 1940 turned to winter, the threat of invasion receded, and the British public showed that it was far more stoic under constant air attack than many had anticipated. Winston's main concern now was to keep the country striking back at the enemy until fresh allies, in particular the United States, could be brought in to help. But there seemed little hope of this happening soon. As 1941 began, the Blitz on Britain's cities continued, and with it, Walter's constant effort to protect his boss. It continued to be an uphill struggle.
As we appeared to avoid some dangers, so we walked into others. Winston decided that he wanted to watch the bombing of London from the roof of the annex. Trying to dissuade him was useless. I told him there was no liftman available to take him to the roof, and I soon had my answer. "You can take me up," he said. "Arrange to get the keys every night, and also the password, so that you will always be ready." This was not quite so easy as it appeared. For when the top floor of the building was reached, we had to pass through 6 secret rooms, all of which were securely locked. I had the keys of them all. After going through all the rooms, we had to climb a short upright ladder to a trapdoor, and thence onto the roof. Here he would walk around, watching from every single angle. I realized how exposed it was, and whilst he was on a trip, I had sandbags put around the sides and a form of covering above.
As the Blitz went on, Walter had another reason to worry, for his friendship with Winston's secretary Mary Sherburne was deepening.
We were on the roof during the time of the dropping of 1,000 incendiary bombs near the Houses of Parliament, and I could see flames rising, some of which came from the area where Miss Sherburne lived. I was apprehensive, and without realizing it, must have shown my fears. Winston, who had been walking around, came over to me, looked straight into my face and said, "Are you scared, Thompson?" "Yes," I replied. "So am I," he agreed. "Let's go down." Shortly after reaching his office, he rang for me to go there. And as I entered, he said, "What was wrong, Thompson? I noticed the change in your face. You don't scare easily." I told him about the flames near Miss Sherburne's home. And after telling him that all was well, he said, "I am pleased. You do not have to worry again tonight."
Just occasionally, amid the worries, there were lighter moments.
On another occasion on the roof, he had watched the bombing for some time and decided to sit down whilst he smoked his cigar. A few minutes later, the RAF sentry who patrolled the roof came hurriedly across the roof to Winston and stood to attention in front of him, saying, "Sir, will you please get up at once? You're sitting on the chimney stack and you have smoked them all out below." Winston burst out laughing. How he had enjoyed having picked the main chimney instead of a smaller one, which might not have been in use. It really made his day.
On a number of occasions when a raid was predicted, Winston insisted on visiting the anti-aircraft batteries which were defending London. Walter tried to dissuade him, but was always overruled. He then obtained the use of an armoured car, but after a single trip in the sardine can, as he called it, Winston refused to travel in it again, insisting that he must take the same chances as everyone else. As they were returning from one trip, a strange event occurred.
During my years with him, Winston had always travelled in the seat on the near side of the car, sitting behind me, and he has never opened or shut a car door. On this occasion, I went ahead of him as he left the guns and moved round the car to the near side where I waited with the door open for him. To my surprise, when he reached the off side of the car, he stopped, looked at me, then turned and opened the door on the off side and got in and sat down, shutting the door as he did so. Our next stop was some distance away, and as usual we had to travel fast. A number of explosions occurred, and suddenly the offside of our car was lifted into the air. But except for shaking, no serious damage was done. I feel that our speed probably prevented the car from turning over on its near side. Winston was not disturbed in the slightest, and leaning forward he said, "That was a near one, Thompson. It must have been my beef on this side that pulled the car down." Talking to him about the incident on our return to the annex, I asked why he had sat on the offside, which was something he never did. His reply surprised me. "I saw you with the door open, but when I reached the other side, something seemed to say, 'Stop.' Then it appeared to me that I was to get into the other side, which I did." His hand went up as he added, "The mission has to be carried out, Thompson."
Sometimes Walter's attempts to save his boss from himself led to friction.
One night, an air raid had been in progress for some time, and he stood with Sir John Anderson in the doorway of the annex watching the shell bursts and the searchlights. At this entrance were double doors, one of which was closed. Winston was standing in front of Sir John on the open side. Suddenly I heard something whistling through the air. "Something's coming this way," I shouted. In the same second, a shell, or part of one, hit the railings opposite and there was an explosion. I flung my arms round the Prime Minister and swung him bodily behind the closed door. He was horrified and indignant. "Don't do that," he roared at me. He was no lightweight, and I had not only to act fast but to use considerable force. It took him a little while to recover from his anger and astonishment, and I think he was surprised at the speed with which I swung him round. It was lucky for him, however, that I did act so quickly, as some metal flew through the open doorway and into the thigh of a colleague of mine who had been standing to the rear of us all. When Winston realized what had happened, and that if I had not swung him round, the metal would probably have hit him in the stomach, he was full of apologies to me, and thanked me for my quick action. He said, "One thing I like about you, Thompson, you react with considerable speed at all times."
In London, the increasing ferocity of the air raids and Winston's insouciant attitude to them kept Walter constantly on edge. But things were not much better during the weekends when they went to checkers. For the house was well known to be the weekend retreat of Britain's Prime Minister, and as Walter was only too aware, its isolated position, well within German bomber range, made it a tempting target for an assassination attempt. Winston always cherished his weekends at checkers as an essential way of relaxing from the constant stress of running the war and the cramped and claustrophobic conditions in the annex in London. But as the German bombing offensive spread, with attacks on many British cities, Walter's concern about Winston's vulnerability during the weekends at checkers increased. He could see the very real possibility of an assassination attempt.
Enemy bombers were now beginning to come over this spot in increasing numbers on their way over London to the Midlands. I recall one occasion when a German bomber passed over, seemed to recognize the place, and turned and repassed it from many different angles for a period of minutes. I now suppose that it was taking photographs for future reference and possible attack. Not long after, it happened again, this time at night. This time I was sure that the German was preparing for a run-in on the target. He was low, His props were feathering, and he had illuminated half the country with slowly descending parachute flares. These visits had been noted by many people. All who talked over the matter with him felt sure it presaged a series of planned attacks on him. It was a form of assassination against which I could not protect him. The chances of killing Churchill by aerial bombs was not considered very good. But a planned attack of dedicated raiders and suicide parachutists landing in numbers on the grounds of Chequers was well within the cunning of the Germans and had a good chance of success.
Walter had good reason for his nervousness, for the Germans not only had highly capable parachute and glider-borne troops, but they had shown considerable skill in using them. It was Hitler himself who came up with the idea of using gliders. On the 10th of May, a force landed on top of the Belgian fortress of Ebenemal and silenced the guns so that the bridges could not be bombarded. It was captured the next day. Later in the war, similar methods were used to rescue Mussolini from the mountain-top hotel where he was being held prisoner. A small group of German airborne troops landed by glider and swiftly overwhelmed the guards. Mussolini was then taken away by a light aircraft. If the German airborne forces were capable of such feats, there is little doubt that they could have mounted an attack on Chequers, and Walter was clear about how it might be planned.
The bomb attack by high raiders would end, leaving the security about Churchill with a sense that the attack might be over, when in actuality it was just about to start. It might be the signal that the paratroops were at that precise moment descending upon our premises. We were ready for this too. Every outbuilding at Chequers was manned and lethal. Every dovecote could spit death in any direction and put a beam of light into the darkest recesses of the shrubs, hedges and trees. The next night, the grounds of Chequers got well sprinkled by high raiders. Bombs going off like intermittent explosions in a system of steam boilers. I waited in the darkness. I heard parachutists land in the trees, heard them cut their shrouds and climb down to the earth. But they weren't coming that night.
But despite these precautions, Walter was not happy with the security at Chequers, particularly on the nights of full moon. But he knew the huge importance which Winston attached to getting away from London at weekends to recharge his batteries, so a more secure site would have to be found.
The place selected for this purpose was Ditchley Park, a few miles from Oxford, where all the necessary means of communications were installed.
Downing Street moved to Ditchley in North Oxfordshire for the first time on the 8th of November 1940. The house was to be used on 15 occasions over the next year and a half, sometimes at very short notice to its long-suffering owners, Conservative MP Ronald Tree and his American-born wife Nancy. Although neither Walter nor Winston could have foreseen it, 1941 was the year in which Winston's determination to keep Britain in the fight against Hitler would pay off. The war expanded into a truly world war, and Britain gained the two allies who would ensure ultimate success. Winston's policy of trying to strengthen Britain's relations with the neutral United States of America on the basis that the great democracy would eventually be obliged to enter the war against Nazism received a welcome boost early in 1941, when President Franklin Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act, which enabled US arms and supplies to be sent to Britain, for which payment would not be expected until after the war.
The wonderful help by President Roosevelt followed the visit to this country of Harry Hopkins, who was at the time a very sick man. He was to ascertain the exact position in which we were and to assure us of the support of the President. Many rumours of all kinds had been reaching the United States, and unfortunately 2 American ambassadors, Kennedy and Bullitt, were of the opinion that we were finished. Fortunately for us, the President had faith in our survival, and his emissary, Hopkins, was able to give Winston that assurance. He and Winston talked at great length, the outcome of which was an understanding and a friendship which lasted to the end. Hopkins' words to Churchill, that whatever happened, the President would see us through, had a most heartening effect on Winston at this time.
At least he had something to cheer him up, for in every other way, spring 1941 was a dreadful time. The Germans occupied Yugoslavia and then invaded Greece. British troops were sent from North Africa to help the Greeks, but they were soon forced out. Then the Germans captured Crete with a daring airborne assault, and Rommel attacked again in North Africa, forcing the British back into Egypt. For Churchill and the British people, it was difficult to say with any confidence how or when the tide of war could be turned. But then suddenly and amazingly, Britain gained an ally when Hitler unexpectedly invaded the Soviet Union during the early morning of the 22nd of June. Despite his long opposition to Bolshevism, Churchill immediately made a radio broadcast stating that any enemy of Hitler would be a friend of Britain. He also ordered that sorely needed US Lend-Lease aid should be diverted to the Soviets. With the anti-Nazi alliance expanding, the time seemed ripe for a first meeting between Winston and President Franklin Roosevelt. It was to take place in total secrecy in a remote bay on the Newfoundland coast of Canada. As the planning began for Winston's first secret overseas trip since he had braved the Luftwaffe to fly to France, Walter probably didn't realize how much his job of guarding Winston was about to change. This first wartime crossing of the Atlantic would mean braving the threat of German U-boats and long-range bombers. And it was to be the forerunner of more than 200,000 miles of travel across oceans and continents, constantly at risk from accident or assassination. As Winston Churchill prepared to cross the Atlantic in August 1941, his minders were desperate to prevent the Germans finding out and ambushing his ship with U-boats or arranging for assassins to be waiting for him. Walter described some of the subterfuges which were arranged to keep his whereabouts secret.
A Flag Day was to be held in the near future, approximately a week after our departure. One morning, by pre-arrangement, a lady with a flag tray full of flags came to number 10 Downing Street, where Winston purchased some flags and stood on the steps while photographers took pictures of the occasion. The pictures were released on the actual Flag Day, when we were already in Placentia Bay with the President.
Winston was in high good humour as his party travelled up by train to Edinburgh and on to Thurso. A destroyer then took them to Scapa Flow, where they went aboard the battleship Prince of Wales. This had only been commissioned 5 months earlier and had already taken part in the sinking of the German battleship Bismarck.
The weather from the start was so foul that after 2 days some of the escorting destroyers had to leave us. Several times also we had to alter course to avoid contact with U-boats reported ahead.
Despite these lurking dangers and the weather, Winston got the most relaxing break he had had since becoming Prime Minister. He passed the time reading novels, watching films, and losing to Harry Hopkins at backgammon. On the morning of Saturday, the 9th of August, the Prince of Wales sailed into Placentia Bay. She passed
Sir Alexander Cadogan and myself went aboard. When we reached the quarterdeck, the President, supported by his son, stood by the rail whilst the two national anthems were played. Winston then moved forward. It was a most impressive moment. The two great leaders seemed at once to be drawn to each other, and for an emotional moment, there was complete silence. Then they greeted one another warmly, and the Prime Minister said, "At long last, Mr. President," to receive in reply, "Glad to see you aboard, Mr. Churchill." Winston then produced a letter from His Majesty King George VI, which he handed to the President, at the same time making some statement, which was to have been recorded by a sound camera. Although two separate attempts were made to record what was said by Winston and the President, most regrettably these words, of such great historical value, were lost. The formalities over, the British and United States Chiefs of Staff got down to business and later lunched together in the Augusta, whilst Winston and the President had their meal alone in a separate cabin. In the meantime, I'd been taken over by Mike Riley, the head of the President's personal bodyguard, who showed me over the Augusta and gave me lunch.
This was Walter's first meeting with the man he was to work closely with over the next 4 years. Together, they were to save their bosses from several attempts on their lives.
Sunday, August the 10th was a particularly fine day, and was to be one which I'm sure will long be remembered by all. A church parade was held and was attended by British and American sailors who joined in the service on the quarterdeck of the Prince of Wales. The setting was simple but most impressive, as the President, accompanied by his son Elliot and a large staff, came on deck and took their seats with Winston near the lectern, which was draped with the flags of both countries. The service was conducted by British and American naval chaplains, and all those present sang the hymns which Winston had selected, and the emotional feeling of solemnity relaxed somewhat. Winston was deeply touched and stirred by this service, which was carried through with such simplicity that for a time that war was temporarily forgotten. Occasionally, however, our thoughts were brought back to reality, as in the distance could be heard the US planes patrolling around the bay. All the time I stood, with my American counterpart, behind Winston and the President, and was able to see the mass of sailors of both nations mixed in together, all of whom spoke the same language and were probably of the same faith. The President and Winston, on the last night of their meeting on the Augusta, had dinner together, whilst I was having a meal with Mike Riley and his colleagues. I'd met the President with the other members of our party, but now Mike Riley decided I should be properly introduced before we left for England. As we approached the President's cabin, we met Winston coming out. I told him what was happening, and then quite firmly he said, "Oh no, I will perform that introduction myself. He led me back into the cabin towards the President and said, "Inspector Thompson has guarded me faithfully for a period of nearly 20 years. It gives me great pleasure to present him to you." It was a very proud moment for me, as the President took my hand in a firm grip and after talking for a few minutes said goodbye and added, "Look after the Prime Minister. Take care of him. He's about the greatest man in the world. In fact, he may very likely be the greatest. You have a terrible responsibility in safeguarding him. You have the responsibility of 4 or 5 million people, Thompson." He then asked about the Prime Minister's health, and on being assured that he took great care of himself, he smiled and I left him. Our leave-taking was very impressive. The crews of both fleets lined the rails of their ships, and to the strains of the Star-Spangled Banner, we commenced our homeward journey. As we passed the Augusta, the Prime Minister stood at the salute, remaining so until we had passed all the US ships. He then returned to his cabin and sat down, whilst tears of relief flowed down his cheeks. He looked up at me, but did not speak. He then retired to rest. The following day, over the ship's loudspeaker, came the news that we were going first to Iceland and then on to Scapa Flow. Our route would follow a course frequently used by convoys to England. The news over the loudspeakers that a large convoy lay ahead excited us all. Signals went out from the Prince of Wales to the Commodore in charge of the convoy, which, as we approached, opened out into 2 lines, allowing us to pass through the centre. There were over 70 ships, all crammed with supplies of all kinds. It was a wonderful sight, as the little escorting vessels fussed around like a hen with her chicks. The crews lined the ships, and Winston placed himself in such a position that he could be seen by all the men as we passed the ships. Sirens were sounded, and men cheered. And Winston, being touched by this wonderful sight, said, "A delectable sight, and a worthy contribution from our American friends." So that we could see all the ships and their crews, the Prince of Wales retraced her steps, passing again between the lines of the convoy. After which, with a message of good luck from Winston, we proceeded on to Iceland.
There, with Walter as always close beside him, Winston reviewed the British troops who had recently arrived to defend the island. Prince of Wales then sailed on homewards. Twice she had to alter course to avoid menacing U-boat sightings. But Scapa Flow was reached safely, and there Winston took his leave of the battleship's crew.
On your first cruise, you met the Bismarck, and on your second, you met the illustrious President of the United States. I think you will feel that you have taken part in these important events, and that may be an interest to you when the full story can be made known.
Sadly, some of the men who had listened to Winston's speech were to perish within a few months, when Prince of Wales was sunk in the Far East. Walter and Winston then returned to London, where Winston was surprised to find Clementine and his cabinet waiting to greet him. Winston's trip had been well worthwhile. Before the end of the year, the whole impetus of the war had changed. The Soviet Union had not only stopped the German advance in front of Moscow, but launched a massive counterattack, which was pushing the Germans back. Even more critically, the United States was no longer a neutral, but an ally. On the 7th of December, the Japanese had attacked the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and launched simultaneous assaults on the US Protectorate of the Philippines and British and Dutch colonies in the area. Three days later, Hitler made Winston's fondest wish come true by declaring war on the United States. Even though the Allies faced many more disasters, as Winston said when he heard about Pearl Harbor, "Now we have won." But before that day arrived, he was to be exposed to many more dangers. These would include not just more nerve-wracking journeys, exposed to enemy attack, but a near confrontation with a mad gunman who was determined to kill him.